All right, good morning and welcome to the Council of State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference for this webinar about data centers in the Midwest. I'm John Davis. I serve as the CSG Midwest Office Liaison to the MLC's Energy and Environment Committee, which is co-hosting today's event. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Jessica Leinhardt, who is Director for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, the other co-host, and Christina Luperini, who is in our office and will help run the webinar. Before we get started, I'll just review a couple of housekeeping notes. If we could advance to the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of that recording will be made available later this week on the CSG Midwest website. We will take questions and comments at the end of the presentations. Please use the Q&A feature or raise the hand button, and we'll call on you to speak. Those features can be found at the bottom of your screen. If you raise your hand, we'll call on you when the time comes. Okay. Today's webinar will conclude the Energy and Environment Committee's work for the 2023-24 biennium. So I would like to thank the committee's officers for their work, leadership, and guidance in making events like this successful. Joining us today is Illinois State Senator Laura Ellman, who is both a member of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus and co-chair of the Energy and Environment Committee. She has graciously agreed to moderate this webinar. At this point, I'll turn things over to Senator Ellman to introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jess. And thanks to all of my colleagues on both the committee and in the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus for hosting this event, and to all of you who have joined us today. And a special thank you goes out to our presenters for the time and effort they've already put into preparing for today's session. At the GLLC's annual meeting in September, we passed a resolution to study the impact of hyperscale data centers on water use in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin. This session will begin the efforts of the GLLC Water Use Committee to understand emerging water uses and help guide the sustainable expansion of this industry in our region. Today, we'll look at the growth of data centers in the Midwest and the impact of that growth on the region's water resources. We hope to leave you with information and points to consider in your upcoming new legislative sessions. Today's webinar includes overviews of data centers, their growth, and their water and electricity uses, and of the geology of groundwater and groundwater governance. I'm particularly excited because we have two great presenters lined up for today's discussion. Dr. Lauren Bridges is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, and her research includes the socio-technical, political, economic, and environmental politics of big data infrastructures. She's currently writing a book on the limits of digital growth and the elemental politics of digital infrastructure expansion in Northern Virginia and Southern California. Dr. Bridges holds a PhD and a master's in communication from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in creative writing, publishing and editing from the University of Melbourne, and a BA in business from Queensland University of Technology. Then after Dr. Bridges' presentation, Dr. Carrie Jennings will walk us through the geology of groundwater and groundwater management policy in the Midwest. Dr. Jennings is a research and policy director for Freshwater, a Minnesota-based nonprofit dedicated to science-based approaches to preserve and sustain water resources. A licensed professional geologist, she applies her understanding of geology and hydrogeology to policy to reduce surface water pollution and improve groundwater sustainability. She previously worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, where she was Science Reports lead in the groundwater section of the EcoWaters division. In her 24-year field geologist career at the Minnesota Geological Survey, she published 35 peer-reviewed articles, 28 maps, and wrote grants to fund over $2 million worth of applied research. I'm really excited, and I want to thank you both for joining us today. And Again, we will take questions once both speakers have presented. We're going to start off with Dr. Bridges. So Dr. Bridges, we turn the webinar over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Senator Ellman, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so honored to be here and to be speaking with you all today. Thank you to CSG Midwest for hosting this event. This is a very timely topic, and there's a lot of issues to get through. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll see if it works like it did before. Okay. So yes, today I'm going to be talking mostly about the water-related politics of data center development, but as we'll see, water is also deeply entangled with the power and electricity demands of data centers. So just as an overview, I'm going to go through some industry trends, some kind of broader framing about the present moment, then we'll go through some key terms, and then I'll cover some of the latest academic research, and we'll think about some solutions and paths forward. Okay, so global data center capacity is expected to double over the next 5 years. Power consumption is also expected to double, and carbon dioxide emissions are also expected to double along with that. According to the International Energy Agency, data centers could possibly account for around 6% of all US power by 2026. Also, according to a Goldman Sachs report recently, an average ChatGPT query needs nearly 10 times as much electricity as a Google search. So part of the drive of this demand is really coming from the boom in AI. The Goldman Sachs estimates that data center power demand will grow by 160% by 2030. But counter to this, the IEA, or the International Energy Association, forecasts that data center total electricity consumption will reach more than 1,000 terawatt hours in 2026. And this is ahead of the Goldman Sachs estimate. So what I want to highlight here is how there are lots of different figures out there, and some of these are contesting, and it will really depend on your source, and it will depend on what information goes into the models to make these kinds of predictions. These are useful to a certain extent because they can give us an idea of how growth is going to change the industry, but they're not always, we can't rely on them as being 100% accurate because there are different sources of information. Okay. So what we do know is that the electricity demand is growing fastest in the states where there is rapid computing facility growth. So that's in the states that are seeing a lot of data center growth, so Virginia, Texas, et cetera, but we're also seeing growth in the Midwest regions. And this is what is also driving that electricity demand. And as I mentioned at the start, water and power share a somewhat intimate relationship. They're somewhat entangled, and that's because water is still the preferred method to cool servers. So evaporative cooling is the primary method in which it's one of the methods used to cool servers in data centers, and it's still one of the most popular, and it uses a lot of water. But there are other methods that use less water as well, or there's even water-free cooling options in data centers. So globally, data centers are forecasted to consume around 450 million gallons of water daily by 2030, and that's up from 205 million in 2026. In the US, 75 billion gallons of water is expected to be consumed by 2030, or the equivalent of all of London, of what London consumes in about 4 months. And then in Virginia, one of the primary data center markets, or one of the largest data center markets in the US and in the world, which is also my primary site, it's estimated that 1.5 billion gallons of water was consumed in 2023, and this has increased by 2/3 since 2019. So it's rapidly going up. So all of this water intensity is also increasing with the boom in AI. A study published in 2021, for example, estimated that a single ChatGPT request consumes about the equivalent of a 500 ml bottle of water. But importantly, again, just a few weeks ago, the authors of this study warned that their original footprint calculation was based on figures from OpenAI from 2020. And instead, they've come back and re-estimated the amount of water needed for a single ChatGPT request. And they've said that it will actually be more like 4 times as much for ChatGPT 4. And this is because the servers that are built for AI are processing huge amounts of data, and they have more power density, and so they have greater cooling demands. Okay, so what's really important to start off with is that we all have a common language to talk about some of the issues. And to understand the different ways that data centers impact water usage and consumption and water quality, we need to understand what the terms are that are both used in industry and that are used to talk about data center usage, water usage. So there's several different ways in which data centers consume water. The first one is direct water usage, and we might think of this as scope 1. So this is directly at the site of data centers, and it's mostly water that's used for cooling, but it's also water that's consumed for other building purposes. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of variation in direct usage figures. So for example, one professor at Texas Tech University estimates that a typical data center consumes about 3 to 5 million gallons of water per day, or the same amount of water as a city of 30 to 50,000. Whereas a recent report by Fairfax County in Virginia found that data centers, their average data center were using around 38,000 gallons of water per day. So that's the difference between 38,000 and 3 to 5 million per day. That's a large difference. Fairfax County also cited an Amazon study that was recently done. Amazon said that for an average data center around 250,000 square feet, they use approximately 3 million gallons of water per year, which equals around just over 8,000 gallons of water per day. But the Fairfax County staff report also points out that recent articles regarding an Amazon proposed data center campus in Virginia projected the use of water of around 21 million gallons per year, which would be around 640,000 gallons per day. So that's a huge variation from 8,000 to 640 gallons per day. And Amazon replied to that saying that this is based on the peak demand. So I guess this is all just to say it really depends. It depends on the source. It depends on the information that's available. It depends on the location. It depends on the cooling method used, and it depends on the climate. So beyond direct water usage, there's also indirect water usage, and this is quite significant and is important to consider as one of the core primary users of water in data centers. So according to research from Virginia Tech, around 3/4 of water usage by data centers is actually from indirect consumption at the site of electricity generation. But there's also water used in other sections of the tech supply chain, for example, in manufacturing of silicon chips, et cetera. So there are a few other terms that are important to note. It's also important to note that the impacts they're not just related to direct water usage or indirect water usage, but there are also impacts to consider to the watershed. So this can affect water quality. For example, the increase in impervious surfaces might lead to increased runoff, which can both lead to increased flooding and erosion and impact water quality. In Northern Virginia, we're seeing increasing a rise in salinity in the Occoquan Reservoir, which has been attributed to anthropocentric development or the increase in impervious surfaces. Two other terms important to note here are water usage effectiveness and net water positive. So WUE, or water usage effectiveness, is a metric used in the industry to evaluate water efficiency in data centers. What it does is it measures the amount of water used in relation to energy consumed. However, so it's useful to a certain extent because it can give a point of comparison across different sites, but it overlooks several things. So it overlooks the water used in construction, it overlooks threats to the water source, it doesn't differentiate between sources of water, between potable or non-potable water, for example. And also as a relational metric, it can obscure certain things. For example, if a data center operator were running old equipment that used a lot of power but was using less water to cool, it could obscure those kinds of things. And it also highlights a trade-off between power effectiveness and water effectiveness. Then there's also net water positive, which is the idea of putting more water back into the environment than they are extracting from it. But again, it's important to pay attention to the source, where water is being drawn from and where it's being returned to. Okay, so looking at some industry figures, Google and Microsoft, they report their figures. So Microsoft reported a usage of around 2.1 billion gallons of water in 2023. And they also reported that 42% of that water came from areas with water stress. Google reported that it used 6.1 billion gallons of water in 2023 and said around 15% of that is coming from areas with high water scarcity. Amazon doesn't report its a comparable number. There are jurisdiction tensions to be aware of. So, for example, as I mentioned, the Occoquan Reservoir in Northern Virginia, in a recent spate of data center developments that were going through in the adjacent county of Prince William County, the Fairfax Water Authority reached out to local policymakers in Prince William County, pleading them to conduct a water study before going ahead and approving rezoning permits for a new 2,000-acre data center campus. And in this letter, they highlight a recent study that was showing the rise in salinity and development. But what really I want to highlight here is how one particular county their decisions around rezoning might affect an adjacent county that's relying on the same water source. Okay, so industry solutions to these problems range from dropping data centers into the sea and using ambient seawater. So that was an example of a Microsoft project off the coast of Scotland. Google also has a data center in Finland that uses seawater to cool the data center. There's the use of closed loop systems for air conditioning rather than evaporative cooling systems. So closed loop systems use much less water. Ambient cooling, so putting data centers into cool places like underground or in caves or bunkers. There's also the use of immersion cooling, or that is submerging the hardware into non-conductive liquid. But this is a little more tricky. It requires substantial server modification, so it can be expensive for data center operators, which might mean that they're either adverse to the risks or to the cost of installing things like that. Then there's direct-to-chip cooling. Again, this offers a precise cooling method directly at the heat source of the chip, but there are high costs involved. And then there are other ideas that are being tested. So in the Nordic countries, there's recycling excess heat for district heating. I've seen data centers or the server heat coming off of data centers be used to heat swimming pools or greenhouses, etc. And then there's also the use of AI to find both water efficiency and also to run models during the times of day where there might be less water usage. So at night, for example. Okay, so I mentioned the increase in power consumption, and this is leading to new proposals for delayed retirement of coal-fired power plants, the increase of new nuclear deals are being announced. So, for example, in the Midwest, Duke Energy plans to delay its Gibson coal-fired power plant. In Utah, there was, I believe, 2 coal-fired power plants are going to be delayed. In Wisconsin, there's the Alliant Energy is going to delay the coal usage for another decade. In Nebraska, we're seeing similar delayed retirements of coal-fired power plants in Georgia, Maryland, and West Virginia, and all of them are citing data center demand as part of the issue. Similarly, as I mentioned, there are nuclear power deals being struck up, both, so the 3 Mile Island deal with Microsoft is a promise to purchase 90% of the power that will be produced. But there's also proposals for on-site small modular reactors at data center sites, or co-locating data centers at nuclear power generation sources. So in terms of water, there are adjacent and accompanying issues that come with these energy proposals as well. So nuclear relies on water. There are two types of water that nuclear uses, and that's processed water and cooling water. The processed water is used to generate electricity, and the cooling water is obviously used to cool. And that cooling water runs through the whole system, and then it eventually gets expelled out back into the body of water where it was drawn from. And it also increases thermal pollution in an area, which can degrade water quality and change the ambient temperature and negatively impact marine ecosystems. There's also the turn to natural gas as a bridging fuel for these energy capacity concerns. And natural gas also uses a lot of water. But there's also a concern here around the impacts to air quality. Natural gas is also being proposed as an alternate to diesel backup generators. But again, the methane impacts are something to consider there. Okay, so let's look quickly at the policy landscape. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but there's a lot of ordinances and proposals around mitigating the environmental and social costs of data centers that are being proposed across the United States. Virginia, which is, as I mentioned, my primary site, has a lot going on, and that's because it's a very mature data center market. After this, I'm going to quickly look at some of the findings from a legislative report that was released just yesterday, although I've only really had the chance to skim through many of the findings. But essentially, some of the proposals that are being made here are around water transparency and power transparency. There's overlay districts that are proposed to designate data center development in certain industrial areas. There's also proposals to ensure buried transmission lines, limits on potable water usage. In Ohio, there's a proposal for varied rates for data center operators, and for the purchase power agreements for data center operators to, I think it's they have to assure that they're going to pay 90% of the purchase power agreement in advance of entering into these purchase power agreements. So there's a range of different proposals that are trying to mitigate these impacts. So let's turn quickly to the JLARC report that was just released yesterday in Northern Virginia. Some of the main findings here is that essentially that the power demand will be really hard to meet, especially with the Virginia Clean Energy Act, or the Virginia Clean Energy Act. And there's a need to expand renewables to meet these power demands. There's also a proposal to explore separate rate classes, as they're doing in Ohio. There are air quality concerns around diesel generators. There's a call for proper oversight from the Department of Environmental Quality, especially regarding water withdrawals. There's also a call for local governments to consider requiring water use estimates as part of the permit process. And there's concerns around noise pollution and land use and other aesthetic concerns, which are mostly architectural issues. So what's missing from this report? Several things. So in terms of the environmental impact, it doesn't look at, really importantly, it doesn't look at the cumulative environmental impacts of data center development in the region or in specific areas. Still, every data center that is cited and every new proposal that requires a change of zoning is done, the environmental impact statements are done on a case-by-case basis. And this is problematic because it doesn't consider how the cumulative development of a region will have long-term impacts. There's also a lack of consideration for climate resilience and the long-term availability of resources, both energy and water. There's a lack of discussion around life cycle carbon emissions. So, for example, the scope 2 and 3 carbon emissions. There's a concerning lack in just generally in the discourse around e-waste. So there's no national e-waste policy. E-waste policies are state by state based, and there are a few states that actually ban the dumping of e-waste. And servers have to be replaced every 3 to 5 years. So this is just a part of the story that is worth considering. And then there's soil and land degradation. There are also social impacts that aren't considered in the report. So, for example, there are community inequities that need to be considered when rates will be hiked to meet the increased demand. There's the question of cultural and historical preservation in areas, especially in Native American sites. There's concern around the increase in housing burden. So the development of data centers in certain areas can then increase housing prices without directly increasing employment opportunities, which can then further lead to displacement. There are public health concerns, especially around the air pollution from backup generators. And then there are workforce and labor dynamics to also be considered. Just in my last minute, I'm going to go over some recommendations for policymakers. So number one, and most importantly, and I hope I've highlighted in this presentation, that there needs to be more transparency around reporting. And local policymakers have a really important role here, but also state policymakers do too, and federal policymakers. But the transparency needs to be mandated before rezoning permits are actually approved. There needs to be improved oversight, especially in the cumulative impacts of development. There needs to be consideration for equity and impacts on marginalized communities or vulnerable communities. There could be consideration to just restrict development in areas that are already experiencing water stress or grid reliability concerns. I think this forum gives us a really good example of regional collaboration, which is going to be needed because there are jurisdictional boundaries that need to be overcome, and there needs to be a conversation across jurisdictional boundaries and across all states of government. And then there could be the option to incentivize sustainability. All right, I've gone over my time. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Bridges. Okay, I'd like to introduce next Dr. Jennings. And Dr. Jennings, welcome and take it away.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Thank you, Dr. Bridges. That was very helpful for me as well. And I hope not to repeat many of the things that you talked about. But what I want to talk about to the gathered group, which I would call the glaciated mid-continent as far as the area that we're covering, is what to think about when you're siting data centers as far as where the groundwater is. You may know that geology is rather stubborn. It's hard to move around, and we have to think about the geology first and then the water that is contained within those layers. So the learning objectives I laid out were to put this proposed water use in the context of the distribution of groundwater, where it's currently being used and how it's being used, where there's already water scarcity or abundance, what the priorities for groundwater use are as far as what we see in the existing policy, and if there are alternatives to using groundwater. And I'm basing this mainly on a deep dive that we did in EPA Region 5, and these are the states in EPA Region 5. And in this region, we described the existing system of groundwater governance, and we're assessing its adequacy to support the sustainable use and mindful of existing challenges. And this is summarized in a report called Groundwater Governance in EPA Region 5. We initially looked at where the knowledge is being produced, who is producing it, and how adequate that was, what the current institutions were in the state surrounding groundwater, the different approaches to governance, and then the challenges. And this was a 18-month project that took place during COVID with a team of people from the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. We had some interns from Harvard, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Water 365, and the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy with Joyce Foundation funding. So you can easily find summaries of this work on the Joyce Foundation website. We followed that initial study, which actually included interviews with the 6 states in EPA Region 5 and 25 of the 35 sovereign nations in that geography, with a second phase of work that we're just concluding. And if you can see the blue stars on this map, these are places where we hosted conversations in specific aquifers that are shared across political jurisdictions, because we wanted to understand how those jurisdictions were working together. And on this map, you'll also see the diagonal lines that include the ceded territories of the tribal nations, which are marked by the brown symbols with the cross. And just summarizing quickly what Dr. Bridges talked about and maybe putting into other terms, a 1 megawatt data center consumes a lot, about 300,000 people's worth of water. A medium-sized data center is you're looking at 3 hospitals or 2 18-hole golf courses. And then if you look at the number of searches that are conducted by billions of users, if you're doing 10 to 50 searches a day, you're using 2 cups of water. So multiply that by the number of searches. These are just putting it into some different terms, and we appreciate there's a large range in water use, but we're expecting this water use to go up. I want also to broaden this conversation a bit because you already have large water users in your region, and these include irrigated agriculture, textile manufacturing, the manufacturing of biofuels, and green hydrogen, which is on the horizon, beverages, biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, power generation, and on, and add to this the use of your cities. So just to make sure we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing, groundwater, I'll define it for you. It is water that began as precipitation, and in our region, that precipitation sometimes fell as snow and became a glacier, and then it melted and entered the ground. It's stored in the pore spaces of sediment and rock. The connectivity of those pores impact how easily pumped that water is. It is rare to have large open caverns, though, in this region. The water is attractive for cooling because it's insulated by the geology that hosts it, and so it approaches the average annual temperature of the region. And the water could be connected to surface water features, providing cold water to those springs or rivers or lakes, or it may be confined and not connected to surface water, but accessed through deeper wells that penetrate the confining layer and may have pressurized water rising up at the surface in a flowing artesian well. And this also should make you start thinking about if water started as precipitation or glacial melt and entered the ground, it can be of a variety of ages. It can be this year's precipitation, or it can be the age of glacial melt, or anywhere in between. And that actually has a bearing on how sustainable the water use is. And let me just now define a few things about wells for you. A well is a pipe in the ground. In a simple situation, you would have driven it in with a hammer. It would have had a perforated screen at the bottom in place where you thought water would be. In modern construction, you have a pipe that's sealed into the ground until you access the aquifer of interest, and you have a screen down there where the aquifer is being accessed. The construction of wells may be regulated by your health department or Department of Natural Resources, and the permit associated or the registration associated with the well may specify how the well should be constructed. It may also require a licensed water well contractor to construct that well, and it may also require that the drilling records and then pumping records are available, because those provide valuable information. It may also require that the water be tested upon construction of the well to make sure that it is safe to drink. And then it may require that a well be sealed later because it provides a point of contamination. All of these things vary across your provinces and states, but that is the general construction of a well. And then finally, the concern with a high capacity well of any kind is that it depresses the surface of the aquifer or the water table. And this is called a cone of depression because in 3 dimensions, it does create a cone shape. And it is this cone of depression that forms and may eventually lower the entire water table. But the initial cone of depression is what can strand shallower wells and make them not able to access the water that they had been using. So, what questions should you as states and provincial authorities be asking when a large water user comes into your region or is planning to come into the region? And I would say you want to understand what the distribution of usable groundwater is, who's already using it, where scarcity is a concern, what are your societal priorities for using groundwater, and are there alternatives? So let's just go through these sequentially. Bedrock does control the distribution of groundwater, and this map, if you really like it, is available as a puzzle from the USGS. It's a hard puzzle, but I can just say that these red and orange units don't host usable amounts of groundwater. This is the Canadian Shield, where you have crystalline rocks like granite that really only have fractures that hold water. The purple and blue layers may host usable fluids, and I'm using that word fluids because some of these rocks may host petroleum fluids. So if you draw these kind of large boundaries and you kind of understand why this region is having this discussion about water usage, water intensive industries like data centers, because that's where the water is. At least that's where the groundwater is. In that area also, the Laurentide ice sheet covered this bedrock, so you're not seeing those units at the surface in many cases. Instead, there are multiple layers of sediment, both aquifer sediment and non-aquifer sediment covering this region. And in this region that we studied, EPA Region 5, the distribution of the thickness of glacial sediment varies quite a bit. You can get over 300 meters of glacial sediment in parts of the lower peninsula of Michigan and western Minnesota, whereas bedrock may be very shallow or at the surface beyond the glacial border. The map on the right shows you which of those bedrock units that are first bedrocks in the area that are usable aquifers. So think about the white areas as being places where if you're looking for water, it's only going to be in the glacial sediment layer. And as I said, the glacial sediment may not host usable water. This is in northwestern Ohio, where you see what looks to me like clay sediment. At least I don't see any sand. I don't see any weeping sand bodies on that face in the quarry. And then the aquifer that they would be using in this part of Ohio would be that fractured limestone aquifer. And water in that case would be held along those bedding planes and in the fractures. This is a large glacial sand and gravel deposit, just for comparison. These carbonate units were deposited in continental seaways that spanned the whole continent, whereas the glacial deposits are really rivers that flowed away from the melting glacier. And so this is a large one up in northern Minnesota. So your knowledge about where the geology is and where the groundwater is in that geology is conducted generally by the state geological surveys. In this region, land grant institutions hosted the geological survey and provided information for the legislature. But over the years, the geological surveys have changed positions in some states. They may now be no longer part of the university, but part of a DNR or some other body of government. The groundwater characterization and water level monitoring and modeling takes place in different institutions. And I just present this table so you can see that it's different in every state. And also the funding mechanisms are different for each state for how they acquire this fundamental geologic information. During this work, Michigan had not received much funding in recent years for knowledge production, but they did recently get a bump in funding. Illinois has a lot of federal funding through USGS State Map and EdMap and Great Lakes Mapping Coalition funds. Other Upper Midwest Geological Surveys who may be present on the call, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, I know are in this area, as well as Iowa. All I have available for you is basically how the staffing compares, and that kind of is might suggest the funding, and then where these geological surveys lie. So only Kansas and Iowa are in the universities. The others are in divisions of natural resources or associated with departments of agriculture. And this reflects the prioritization of geology and the information in those states. I would say that Canada has larger provincial geological surveys and robust funding mechanism for the Geological Survey of Canada. Maybe they would argue with me. And I also look to the Canadian universities for really providing a large number of kind of field mapping oriented geologists, which is what you need to have a geological survey. The tribal nations within EPA Region 5 receive funding for their fundamental understanding of their geology from EPA grant funding, which has been in decline. And I will say that the surveys were created in a way that reflects the approach of the colonizers in this region. So many surveys are kind of backing off on what they are doing as far as mapping, or at least doing it in consultation with the tribal nations in their regions. It used to be that well data was the fundamental source of information that a geological survey would compile. And this is just a sample well log that was created by the driller who drilled the well. A driller is not a trained geologist, but often a geologist can look at these records and understand what the driller is conveying about the layers they have drilled through. And usually you can understand at least the aquifer depth, because that's where the well has finished, the water level in that well pipe, which tells you, the average aquifer elevation, results of pumping, like a stress test on the aquifer, how the well was constructed, any issues about the chemistry, and then a geologist can interpret that data. Not all of the states in EPA Region 5 collect this information, but it is a useful source of information, and I think the inaccuracies fall out the more you get, the larger data set you have. And I would say that some of the states potentially on this call, Nebraska, I'll call out, has done kind of state-of-the-art surveying for groundwater using airborne electromagnetic techniques, where a helicopter flies over an area and induces a magnetic field and electromagnetic field, and this detects difference in the resistivity of things underground. Basically, water conducts electricity and magnetism better, so you can find water and also conducting minerals. The helicopter time makes this look like a very expensive approach, and it does definitely require adequate consultation before being done, because a helicopter flying over and dangling something from the air is a very disconcerting sight. So especially consultation with sovereign nations, tribal and First Nations, needs to be conducted. This technique was perfected in Denmark, which has very similar geology to the glaciated parts of the mid-continent. And so I know that the U.S. Geological Survey in Nebraska have used this approach. So who's already using this groundwater, and how much are they using? I found this report, which kind of summarizes things that are probably available on the GSC and the USGS's website, but it shows the distribution of wells and their purpose on the left. And the blue and the green colors are domestic and agricultural irrigation wells. And on the right, you'll see the depth. So you'll see that along the Mississippi Valley between Minnesota and Wisconsin and down into northern Illinois, they're going quite deep for some of the groundwater. Similarly, in South Dakota and Nebraska. But I also want to point out this stark boundary on the left between the blue and the white areas, because that is your fundamental limit of groundwater because of the geology of the Canadian Shield. So we're really in Canada looking at southern Ontario, this triangular area nestled between the Great Lakes, and then parts of southern Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And this map is just to show that the percentage of Canadians that are using groundwater in that area, in that little triangular region between the Great Lakes. In our original study, we also looked at how the different states were reporting the groundwater uses. We're not sure all of these states are reporting in the same way, so I would take especially the Illinois record with a grain of salt, especially the recent decreases in 2018 and 19. We think they're pretty consistent, with public water supply or domestic water use being the highest, and then irrigated agriculture in green, kind of varying with how sandy the terrain is in these farmed areas, and industrial use kind of varying with the age of industrialization of the region. So with the lower and eastern Great Lakes states being more industrialized than those in the West. And as far as domestic use goes, sadly, we use most of our nice clean groundwater for flushing toilets. I want to show you just the map of irrigated agriculture because this again relates to the original geology, and it's the glacial geology. Sandy glacial soils have to be irrigated. And this is a map of the percent of land that's equipped for irrigation. And this is easily mapped by the air because it's easy to see those circular areas of center pivot irrigation. And imagine these areas originating as meltwater streams that emerged from melting ice fronts. And then in some areas, that sand especially was blown into large dune complexes. So you can see this area along the eastern part of Lake Michigan from Indiana up into Sleeping Bear Dunes. And then also, of course, the Nebraska sand hills, where it feels like sand is still on the move. The bark and dune forms are so clear. And then you can see the center pivot irrigation in this area centered on Alliance, Nebraska. Irrigation is expanding in the region, at least region 5, because crop genetics are allowing crops to be grown further north, and the temperatures are warming. And with hotter temperatures, we see more irrigation because the periods between rainfall are increasing. So this kind of begs the question, where is scarcity already a concern? Well, an aquifer is like a bank account. So we have to look at the water coming in as well as the water coming out. And this is a map of how the water moves through the glacial sediment layers and potentially into the bedrock. It could get stored anywhere along the way, or it could be returned to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration from the plants that are growing in the area. But this is the potential for recharge, just looking at the soil water balance. And in red, you see 0 to 3 inches a year. And then as you move to the east, you see the higher recharge potential going up to 12 to 15 inches potentially in these areas that just got a bunch of snow. So these lake effect snow regions of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the eastern side of Lake Michigan, northeastern Ohio, and so on. So that's our income, that's your paycheck. Of course, this varies with time, and this is the North American Drought Monitor, which is a collaborative effort of the 3 governments in North America. And we know we had a very dry mid-continent in this last period, in this last growing period. At least it was wet in the early season and then dry later. This, if you look at the graph on the right, is kind of part of a dry trend from the year 2000 to 2024. We had a wetter period, a couple decades there in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then, of course, the dryness of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, extreme dryness. Interestingly, when the area was settled in the 1890s, and it was a wet period, so things looked good then. It's the average of this water coming in that we have to think about, and the long-term potential changes. And at least in the Great Lakes, we are going to see increasing temperatures, which of course will reduce, increase evaporation potentially. Increasing frost-free season might allow a longer period of time to water to soak into the ground. The total precipitation looks like it's going to increase, but it really is the seasonal precipitation that we should be looking at. And then the style of precipitation probably matters as well, because a long duration soaking rain is better than a high intensity rain event. And we have to consider the seasonality of precipitation. And if you see in this one, this model on the left, it looks like summers will be drier in general, even though the average annual precipitation is going to increase. This is modeled, of course. And then you think about irrigation as in terms of really hot days, because typically you're trying to prevent the wilt point, and crops will wilt more easily when it's extremely hot. So that's part of the water, the bank account that we have to think about. But is anybody tracking the actual withdrawals? Is the total volume that has been permitted being tracked by a government? And is it also being tracked of how the aquifers are responding to pumping and climate stress? These technical details also vary across the region, and I'll just point out some quick things that the numbers you see on the top are required by the Great Lakes Compact. So a lot of the states have limits, a threshold for registration of a well consistent with what the international treaty requires. Some states require registration at a lower level. So that just means you want to know where the well is going in. As far as putting a threshold for how much water can be withdrawn, Illinois does not have a threshold for a permit. And then some states require metering of water, some states do not. Some states look at the effect of groundwater withdrawal on cold water systems at the surface, so trout streams or just streams in general, or wetlands or fens. Let me just clarify registration versus permitting. Registration is notification only, but permits, as I mentioned earlier when I was describing the well, may have construction specifics like where the well can be put into the ground, how far away from a building or contamination source, what kind of testing is required. It may require that you can only access one aquifer, not multiple aquifers. Not all states do this. Some of the states allow wells that connect different aquifers that would otherwise be disconnected underground. Some states don't require sealing of unused wells. They may treat monitoring and exploratory borings differently. And some states allow injection of things into the ground like water, and some states may not. This is authority that resides with the EPA and has to be assumed by the state. So this map kind of summarizes where the water is being used primarily, and also so the darker areas are where groundwater is being withdrawn more. And you'll see that those are kind of in the urban fringes and population centers, but also in sandy areas in the central parts of the states. And then the orange dots are where monitoring of the groundwater levels is taking place. So somebody is keeping track in those regions of what all this water use is doing in the long term. And this varies between the states and the provinces and the US, the national surveys. And I think it bears asking, what are the societal priorities for groundwater? And we can think about that in terms of international treaties that have been signed to protect surface water. There is no such international treaty to protect groundwater. And there really are very few agreements across political jurisdictions. In fact, I would say none. There are none. Groundwater is primarily a local issue, and the cities are controlling how much groundwater is being used in their region. If you want to see this kind of in-depth summary of these regions, there are fact sheets that are available, and you can also dive into this 200-page report. But we have summarized the legal structure in these regions and also the technical management and knowledge production across this area. But let me just say, it does vary by kind of the history of when water scarcity first became an issue in a region, when did drought first occur, and how severe that drought was, and then how prioritized the natural resources are. So Wisconsin, for example, does a lot of work just within their Department of Natural Resources, whereas in Minnesota, we have segmented, some say siloed, water governance across 4 different agencies. Other states who have historically not had a lot of attention to water, but maybe paid more attention to oil and gas, may have allowed more federal work to come in and help them understand their water. But if you look at the legal instruments, that kind of reflects the societal priority for groundwater. And in Minnesota, I know I'm getting kind of long. I'll try to wrap up, Jess. The priority of use shows that domestic water supplies and power producers, that's the highest power use, or the highest priority for water use. And if you think about where data centers come in, we're looking at number 5. They would be other users in excess of 10,000 gallons. So this groundwater policy that has evolved in your region, really to be inclusive and consider ecological and human health, should have robust legal instruments, permitting process, groundwater science, and stakeholder participation. I'll skip through the recommendations from our first report and just say cooling with groundwater for either data centers or hospitals, other hot industries. They're taking advantage of this cold water. They're usually cycling the water a few times so that they can meet the kind of water demands. Dr. Bridges did recommend I'm sorry, I'm getting nervous because I'm out of time. She did mention the closed loop system, and this is where you have a coolant circulating and taking advantage of that cold temperature, but bringing non-water into cold fluids into the region. Let me just go kind of quickly. We have not talked to data centers as much as Dr. Lauren Bridges has, but we have two coming into the county where I reside, and we have talked to the engineering firms and our Department of Economic Development about what data center needs are. Power and water, of course, the biggest needs. They would like to be water neutral. Their water has to be especially pure if they're using it to be cool for evaporative cooling, and that is quieter and cheaper. So that's usually how data centers will start an approach. But it would be helpful if the state, in addition to providing incentives, also provided information on regional water availability, power availability, and water reuse options. And I'll just end with this map and say that if you're adding a data center or other large water user, you're adding really a small city to your region. And if you look at this map and the population distribution, you can see that cities and population centers exist on surface water primarily. They move from groundwater to surface water to be sustainable. And the areas to be most concerned about would be in this urban fringe beyond the metropolitan area, where there is a mix of private and municipal wells, because there's the greatest potential for that cone of depression to create well interference concerns. And you're also getting very far from surface water sources. Areas with glacial sediment probably do not have the water availability to support data centers, and I would also caution areas that have seasonal water scarcity that are irrigating or are drought prone. Okay, so those are the recommendations, and I can stop talking now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridges and Dr. Jennings. At this time, we're going to take questions. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, or you can raise your hand and we will call on folks and recognize them. And we've had a couple of helpful links posted in the chat, so be sure to check those out. But to start with the first question, why do data centers tend to prefer groundwater or those type of sources? And that would be to either Dr. Bridges and Jennings to talk about, why that would be preferable.
And I would just say that average annual temperature, it's cold, and it requires less treatment than surface water sources because it tends to have less mineralization.
Yeah, I think that's a good, perfect answer.
And we talked a bit about the resources available for the hydrological survey, and I know a lot of that in the US is coordinated through the federal government. So Dr. Jennings, could you just go over, if you are a legislator in the US looking for information about aquifers and groundwater near you, what is the best source to go to for those?
I think the USGS has a good clearinghouse for groundwater availability, groundwater levels. They tend to work more in states that don't have state geological surveys with continuous or robust funding. So you always should go to the state geological survey first, or as well, because they're complementary sources of information, not competing sources of information.
Sounds good. And a question in from the attendees. Should we expect any changes kind of in this issue area with a new federal administration coming in the United States?
That's a tough question to answer. Yes, I imagine so. So there are different levels of intervention, one being the EPA or the Department of Energy. So I imagine that there's going to be some changes to, the oversight aspect of this problem. But yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say about this prediction, Dr. Jennings.
Yes, can you restate the question?
Sure. Sorry, I had clicked through it. Just what can we expect to change in this issue area with a new federal administration coming in the United States?
I, speaking of the geology, it's really the state is producing the knowledge, and the knowledge should be received by the municipality or the region siting the facility. And so this can be something that is a local conversation, I would say. And I think the states can still work to ensure that they're making their information available and comprehensible to those, municipalities and the tribes, potentially through associations of counties, associations of cities, their Department of Economic Development. So I think that that can still be built no matter what is happening at the federal level.
Yeah, and I'll also just expand on that to say that this is really where local policy and municipal policy can play a really strong role in that before siting, before permitting, ensuring transparency, demanding mitigation strategies, incentivizing mitigation strategies. Yeah, I think that's the important role of local government.
I'll just add one thing, since you mentioned transparency, and that might not be clear what that means, but I think this is corporations coming to states because they're attracted by tax incentives. And sometimes the municipalities courting these industries are required to sign non-disclosure agreements fairly early on in the process. And that creates a lack of transparency, or at least a perceived lack of transparency, at least to the public in that area. So I know that concerns arise among the population surrounding these planned developments.
Thank you
Yes,
both
if
for
I-
that. And then, sorry, go ahead, John.
Sorry, Jess, if I may just intervene, I put this up in the chat. Several people have asked about the slides. I just want to let everyone know the slide decks will be posted later this week to CSG Midwest's website, which conveniently enough is csgmidwest, all one word, .org. So just give us a couple of days to get those up, and they will be available later. So we also have a couple of questions popping up in the chat. One is a question about, will hydrogen drilling affect water aquifers?
The only hydrogen source I know that's being explored in Minnesota is in a crystalline bedrock unit. I don't know, but I only know of one place where that's even kind of a whiff of an idea in Minnesota. I think what's more important is the production of green hydrogen, which involves basically cracking apart the water molecule. I tried to find out what the water use in that process would be, and I don't know. But I think I would be more concerned about technologies like that.
Another question in the Q&A box. So when water is released back into the environment after cooling, is the main concern the impact that hot water will have, or are there additional concerns like the cooling water picking up chemicals as it's used?
It depends. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
Dr.
you go ahead. That's fine.
I mean, it depends what it's being used to cool, I would say. But in nuclear, which I mentioned previously, the cooling water should be kept separate from the processed water. So ideally, it shouldn't have any contamination. It should be very, very clean. And temperature and thermal pollution would be one of the main concerns. But of course, there are leakages, and things do go wrong.
And I would just say, like cooling water or like evaporating water in your teapot, you're going to build up the residue that's held in the water. So you have the potential to create concentrations of salts or calcium carbonate or things like that exceed the surface water standards for discharge. And so a data center or other large water user that uses evaporative cooling might have to build a wastewater treatment plant on the back end to make sure that it's discharging water that meets surface water standards, including temperature.
Thank you. And we touched on this question a little bit, but maybe we can maybe talk about other ways that transparency can be increased. So it seems that there can be a lack of transparency in the early planning stages of data centers. What are strategies to bring water science and public input into the process?
I think this is where there needs to be collaboration across different sectors. Mandating water studies and oversight is really important, but also requiring transparency around projected usage at that point in time. Because once the permitting happens, then it's very difficult to then require transparency. And also Dr. Jennings brought up a really crucial issue around signing NDAs really early in the process, which can make it difficult for other organizations to be looking at the impacts from projected development. But I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Jennings.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I'm kind of reading the other questions coming up in the chat, but I want to let Jess facilitate.
Sure. Yeah, I know. I will come through in the chat. So has aquifer recharge been allowed in the US? In the Midwest, I'm sorry.
And this is, I think it's class 5 wells as categorized by the EPA. So this is authority held by the EPA. The states have to pursue that authority to be able to do injection on their permit injection wells on their own. Typically, the states that do fracking or have injected wastewater or have recharged aquifers have that authority. So it's state by state. It's not consistent. Minnesota does not have that authority. Iowa does. I saw somebody in the chat talk about wells that are 6,000 to 10,000 feet deep in Iowa, and I know that they do have deep injection wells in the area around Des Moines. So, case by case.
Deep injection wells are also an issue in another big energy and environment topic, which is carbon capture. As far as that goes, I do know some states in the Midwest have pursued and already do have authority from the primacy from the EPA on that subject. On water, however, I'm not sure.
And a question in the box is kind of asking both of you to look ahead and perhaps make some educated guesses, but what can we expect from legislatures on data centers in the upcoming session? Do you think there will be more bills on regulations and other pitfalls, or will there be more incentive programs?
I hope that there will be more bills looking at mitigating the impacts. At the moment, I'm at least for the Midwest region, it's looking more like there's an interest in incentivizing growth of the data center industry. But hopefully, hopefully there will be some more consideration around energy grid planning, power capacity concerns, water usage and resource requirements, infrastructure requirements, transmission lines we didn't even talk about today. So I think as you'll see a growth in the industry, some of these capacity issues are going to start to crop up more and more. But I'd love to hear your predictions, Dr. Jennings.
Yeah, and they're less along those lines and more along knowledge production. Understanding the geology is really the bottom line. That takes funding, and I don't think there's going to be a surplus of funding in the Midwest. So I don't think that the state geological surveys and DNRs will change much. But it's possible without a lot of other funding to change the permitting structure of wells. And so I'm hoping that some of these states that have fairly loose regulation and reporting requirements for water that's already being used can tighten that up. You can do that in a low budget year, and that will help with understanding the general status of water balance.
And I do want to just add at this point, there is one comment from in the chat from earlier this morning that someone posted a comment that Illinois is working to propose groundwater regulations. I'll just add that from my position as a staff liaison to the Energy and Environment Committee, I know this is a topic we will be looking at in the new biennium. This seems, from what I've been able to see, it seems to be an issue of it's beginning to appear on legislative radar screens, if you will. So this is something we are very likely to see legislative interest either as bills or as proposals to in some legislatures that do summer study sessions. I suspect we'll be seeing a lot of growing interest in this subject.
I'll just add that Illinois and, Chicago, I consider as the informal capital of this, at least the United States portion of this region. And they've faced the water challenges earlier than the rest of the area. They've, grown more and depleted their cone of depression is deeper and broader. And they have some significant issues that are emerging in their suburban communities that are far away from the Great Lakes. So we should look to them for the scenarios that could develop in the rest of the region if water isn't carefully managed.
Another question is water use by data centers accounted for in the Great Lakes Compact, or are centers too new?
I don't know if there's an expert in the room that could type the answer to that in the chat, because I don't know. I think again, I would want people to take the larger view and just look at large water users or cooling, water for cooling, more generalized categories, because who knows what's going to emerge next year.
And there are a few Great Lakes Compact experts in the room, so I would welcome them to either raise hand or type a response in the chat if they would like to speak to that. But largely, the Great Lakes Compact deals with water diversions from the basin going outside of the basin, where data centers can be large water users that would be withdrawing and discharging within the basin if they're sited here. I believe I remember correctly that there is a trigger in the Great Lakes Compact if there's 5 million gallons a day with a withdrawal. But I would also welcome comments from the group here if they want to add that. And at this point, I don't have any other questions in the box. So if you were waiting, please feel free to ask. I think one thing I wanted to ask Dr. Bridges is I know you've done a lot of work with citizen groups in Virginia. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience there and what kinds of interest groups have mobilized around issues related to this industry.
Thanks for the question, Jess. Yeah, as a pretty mature data center market, there is a very active and vibrant scene for community organizing. And we're seeing a lot of collaborative efforts, especially when there are large campuses like the 2,000-acre campus I mentioned previously, called the Data Center Gateway, or the Digital Gateway, sorry, which has been approved in Prince William County. And their primary role is to attend local county meetings and to coordinate, share information. They host community-led events frequently. They also educate people through writing op-eds in the media. And it's a pretty vibrant scene. They also show up to the legislative sessions as well. And they're talking to policymakers about proposals for their various areas. So yeah, it's a very active scene. And I guess if there are community organizers in the audience, I'd be happy to provide some connections or direct you towards some resources for that kind of work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridges. And I did have a comment in from James Palladori in the chat that I just wanted to direct attention to, that the trigger level for reporting water use in the Great Lakes under the Great Lakes Compact is 100,000 gallons per day. So much smaller than what I said. So thank you, James. James manages that water use database for the Great Lakes Commission. So if you are not familiar with that, please check out that resource. And then I'm also trying to go through Molly's comment regarding the Great Lakes Basin, so I will just read it. So if a data center straddles the Great Lakes Basin line and wants to use Great Lakes water, it would need state approval. If it is outside the Great Lakes Basin, but in a county that straddled the Great Lakes and wants to use Great Lakes water, approval would be needed by all Great Lakes governors. There is a 5 million gallon per day consumptive use clause that requires the state to provide notice to other states. Oh, so perhaps that was my confusion then between 5 million and 100,000. So thank you, Molly and James. And James did go ahead and post the link that will get us over to that water use data for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin.
And to clarify, that's surface water. That does not pertain to the groundwater in that region. There are no rules.
Clarification. Yes. All right. Well, I wanted to reiterate my thanks to Dr. Jennings and Dr. Bridges for two fantastic presentations. And this is a conversation that will be continuing. We have a lot of interest in working through these issues as our state and provincial legislators are kind of grappling with this emerging water use. So thank you both so much. And thank you to the MLC Energy and Environment Committee and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus for their work on this issue. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Jess. And appropriate to a legislative setting, I just want to second everything that Jess has said. And thank you, Senator Ellman, who had to leave us early, and all those who made this webinar possible, especially Dr. Laura Bridges and Dr. Carrie Jennings for very informative presentations. You've given us a lot to consider over the holiday season in a lot of good information for our legislative colleagues to carry into their 2025 sessions. We are now at the end of this session, but this is just the first in a series of CSG Midwest's December webinar series, which you can see here on your screen. The next webinar is 9:30 a.m. Central Time tomorrow morning, and we'll cover the laws and policies that impact youth in child welfare systems. Next week, 3 more webinars will follow. On Monday, a look at the promise of comprehensive adolescent services. On Wednesday, Jess and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus return with a look at Indigenous treaty law in the US and Canada. And on Friday, the series concludes with a look at tech and workforce development in rural areas. I encourage all of you who are still with us to visit csgmidwest.org, take a look at those webinars and register for each and every one of them that interests you. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at csgmidwest.org. And as I said earlier, copies of the presentations will be available, and a recording of this webinar will also be available later this week at csgmidwest.org. Thank you all. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you sticking with us. I wish you a very happy and healthy holiday season and a productive 2025. With that, we're concluded for the day. Thank you.